Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm so glad you could join us for another deep dive. This one is really interesting. We're going to be talking about perceptions of English proficiency in Bangladesh.
It's a fascinating topic, and I think the sources you sent over really highlight just how nuanced it is.
Exactly. I was so surprised by some of the things I learned. It's definitely not as straightforward as it might seem on the surface.
Right, there's this sort of common perception that English proficiency is quite low in Bangladesh, but when you actually look at the research, it's clear that there are so many factors at play.
Absolutely. So let's start digging into those factors, shall we? Where do you think is a good place to begin?
Well, I think the education system is a natural starting point.
Yeah, I think so too.
The sources talk a lot about how English is taught in schools, and one of the key takeaways is that there's a huge amount of variation.
Right, so it's not just a simple yes or no answer to the question of, do they teach English in Bangladesh?
Exactly. It's much more complicated than that.
Like, what kind of variations are we talking about here? Can you give us some examples?
Sure. So one major factor is the quality of English language instruction, which can differ significantly from one school to another.
I see. So some schools might have excellent English programs, while others might be lacking in resources or qualified teachers.
Precisely. And this difference in quality can be really significant, especially when you consider the long-term impact it can have on students' English proficiency.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like if you're not getting a solid foundation in English early on, it's going to be much harder to catch up later.
Exactly.
And the sources also talk about how the emphasis on English varies between schools, right?
Yes, some schools might prioritize English more highly than others, and this can be influenced by a number of things like the school's location.
Location, huh? How so?
Well, for example, schools in urban areas, especially those in Dhaka, tend to place a stronger emphasis on English because it's seen as more essential for professional success in those environments.
Ah, so it's like a supply and demand thing.
Right.
Where the demand for English skills is higher in urban areas, so the schools respond by focusing on it more.
That's a good way to put it. And you also have to consider the resources available to different schools. Schools in wealthier areas, regardless of whether they're urban or rural, often have more funding.
Right, more funding means they can afford better facilities, hire more qualified teachers, and maybe even offer extracurricular activities that help students practice their English.
Exactly. And that creates a sort of uneven playing field where students from more affluent backgrounds have a significant advantage when it comes to learning English.
And it's not just about the schools themselves, right? The sources also point out that the medium of instruction plays a huge role.
Absolutely. And this ties in really closely with what we were just talking about, with the importance of early childhood exposure to language.
Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. So in many schools in Bangladesh, especially at the primary level, the main language used for teaching is Bengali, not English.
Which makes sense. I mean, Bengali is the official language of the country and the language that most people speak at home.
Right, but it means that many students don't get as much exposure to English during those crucial early years when their brains are most receptive to language acquisition.
So even if they're learning English as a subject, they're not necessarily using it in a practical way for a large part of their day.
Exactly, and that can make it more challenging to develop fluency. Think about it this way. Imagine trying to learn to play the piano, but you only get to practice for a few hours a week.
And the rest of the time, you're playing a completely different instrument, like the drums.
That's a great analogy. You might learn the basics of piano playing, but you're not going to become truly proficient unless you have consistent, dedicated practice time.
And it's the same with language. If you're not using it regularly, you're not going to internalize it and become comfortable speaking and understanding it.
Exactly. Now let's layer in another factor, socioeconomic conditions.
Right. Because the sources make it clear that there's a strong link between socioeconomic status and access to quality English education, don't they?
They do. And it's a pretty significant factor in perpetuating these inequalities. Students from families with more resources often have access to private tutors, English medium schools, and sometimes even opportunities to travel or interact with English speakers.
Which, as you said before, really stacks the deck in their favor when it comes to English proficiency.
Exactly. And if you think about the difference in resources between a rural school and a private institution in Dhaka, it's pretty stark.
It's a world of difference. And I think that brings us to another really interesting point that the sources bring up, cultural context.
Yes. This is where things get even more fascinating, isn't it?
It is, because it's not just about the practicalities of learning and using English, it's also about how English is perceived within Bangladeshi society.
Right, and the sources highlight how, in many parts of Bangladesh, English is often viewed as a foreign language, not something that's essential for daily life.
Which again makes sense, given that Bengali is the dominant language and such a strong part of the culture.
Exactly, and this can sometimes lead to a lower motivation to learn English, even if it could open up opportunities.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the perception that English isn't that important can make people less likely to invest the time and effort to learn it.
And that perception can be influenced by a number of things, including historical factors.
Oh yeah, the historical context is a big one. I'm thinking specifically about the legacy of British colonialism in Bangladesh.
Right, and this is a really complex issue. On the one hand, English was introduced during colonial rule and became associated with access to education, government, and certain professions.
So in a way, it was seen as a language of opportunity and advancement.
Exactly, but on the other hand, it was also the language of the colonizers, and that can evoke complicated feelings for some.
It's like a double-edged sword, right? Where English can be both a symbol of progress and a reminder of a difficult past.
Precisely, and this complex relationship with English can shape people's attitudes towards learning and using the language today.
And I think it's a good reminder that language is never just about words. It's also about history, power dynamics, and cultural identity.
Absolutely, and I think that's something that's often overlooked in discussions about language proficiency.
It's easy to get caught up in the numbers and the statistics, but we have to remember that language is a deeply personal and cultural thing.
I agree. And speaking of getting caught up in statistics, I think it's really important to emphasize that the perception of low English proficiency in Bangladesh doesn't represent the whole picture.
Right. The sources are very clear about that. It's not like everyone in Bangladesh struggles with English.
Exactly, and I think that's a crucial point to highlight because it's easy to fall into the trap of overgeneralizing.
Yeah, it's like saying all Americans love baseball or all French people eat snails. It's just not true.
Exactly. There's so much diversity within any country, and Bangladesh is no exception.
And when it comes to English proficiency, the sources point out that there are thriving English-speaking communities in Bangladesh.
Yes, especially in urban areas and among educated populations. English is widely used in business, government, and higher education.
So this perception of low proficiency is more common in certain contexts than others.
Precisely, and I think that's a really important takeaway from this deep dive.
Totally agree. It's about recognizing the nuances and the diversity of experiences within Bangladesh.
Right, because painting an entire country with a single brushstroke is never going to give you an accurate picture.
It's like assuming you know the taste of an entire fruit basket after just sampling one piece of fruit.
That's a perfect analogy. There's so much more to explore and discover.
And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. But before we do, can you give us a quick recap of the key takeaways?
Of course. So we've learned that perceptions of English proficiency in Bangladesh are shaped by a complex interplay of factors, including the education system, socioeconomic conditions, cultural attitudes, historical context, and even the practical opportunities for regular language use.
It's a lot more nuanced than just looking at whether people speak English or not.
Exactly, and understanding these factors is essential if we want to move beyond stereotypes and appreciate the complexities of any culture.
It's about recognizing that individual experiences can vary widely, and we should be careful about making assumptions based on broad perceptions.
Well said. It's a reminder that there's always more to learn and that we should always be open to challenging our own assumptions.
Absolutely. So to our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep digging deeper into the fascinating world of Bangladesh and its languages.
Challenge your own perceptions, and remember, there's always more to discover.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.
See you then.